In the climate-controlled archives of the Virginia Historical Society, catalogued under Miscellaneous Domestic Artifacts, sits a King James Bible dated 1811. It is a heavy, leather-bound volume, typical of the Albemarle County gentry, but it contains a macabre mystery that not even science can explain through standard genealogy. On the page dedicated to family births, beneath the name of Colonel Luther Whitfield, two lines have been obliterated not by time, but by a sharp instrument, likely a knife, scratched with such manic intensity that the parchment itself is torn. These violently erased names belong to Clara and Carolyn Whitfield, twins born into the height of Southern aristocracy, who, according to official plantation records, died of a fever in the autumn of 1837. However, this official narrative of a tragic premature death is directly contradicted by a terrifying discovery made nearly a century later in the basement of a decommissioned hospital. Hidden within the crumbling walls of the Western State Lunatic Asylum were admission papers dated 1838, 1 year after their supposed death, listing the sisters not as deceased, but as patients committed for moral insanity and degenerate hysteria. Adele, what history tried to bury, was a story so horrific to the sensibilities of the time that it required the complete erasure of two human beings. The macabre tale of twin sisters who rejected their caste to enter into a forbidden, spiritual and carnal pact with the same enslaved man, a secret union that would eventually trigger a silent massacre of the Whitfield legacy. Before we unseal the documents that reveal this dark secret, I invite you to join our growing archive of the forgotten. Subscribe to Before the Story and enable notifications, for history is often far stranger than the fiction we are sold. If you believe that the truth, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be brought to light, leave a like on this video. We are also interested in knowing where you are watching from tonight. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story. The year was 1837. And the landscape of Albemarle County, Virginia, was a deceptive tapestry of rolling green hills and manicured gardens, concealing the brutal machinery of the plantation economy that sustained it. Oak Haven, the ancestral seat of the Whitfield family, was architecturally imposing, a red-brick Georgian mansion that demanded order, silence, and absolute submission from the 200 enslaved souls who labored in its shadow. Colonel Luther Whitfield, a widower of severe reputation and considerable political influence, ran his estate with a military precision that extended to the management of his own bloodline. His twin daughters, Clara and Caroline, had been absent from this stifling atmosphere for 2 years, sent to a finishing school in Philadelphia intended to refine their manners and dampen the unnerving unity that had characterized their childhood. When the carriage deposited the 19-year-old sisters back at the steps of Oak Haven in April of 1837, the household staff noted an immediate and unsettling change in their demeanor. They did not exhibit the demure relief expected of young ladies returning to the safety of their father's house. Instead, they moved with a synchronized, predatory confidence, communicating in a series of glances and half gestures that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. The Philadelphia experiment, rather than breaking their bond, appeared to have hardened it into something impenetrable, a fortress of two built against the authority of one. They were identical in feature, raven-haired, pale, with eyes of a startling clear grey, but divergent in spirit. Family letters suggest Clara was the cold strategist, while Caroline was the vessel of volatile, raw emotion. Upon their arrival, they did not first seek an audience with their father, a breach of protocol that sent a ripple of unease through the assembled house slaves. Instead, witnesses later deposed that the twins walked arm in arm past the main house, their silk skirts dragging in the dust, directly toward the holding pens near the overseer's cabin. A new group of enslaved men had been purchased that very morning to bolster the workforce for the tobacco harvest, and among them was a man recorded in the purchase ledger only as Samuel. He was described in later fugitive notices as tall, of distinctive bearing, and possessing an intelligence that unsettled potential buyers, marking him as troublesome despite his lack of physical resistance. The moment the twins stopped at the fence, looking down into the pen where the men were being chained for transport to the quarters, is marked by historians as the true beginning of the tragedy. There was no exchange of words, no overt gesture that could be cited as inappropriate by the overseers watching nearby, yet the atmosphere reportedly shifted with a palpable electric tension. Samuel, who had been staring at the ground, raised his head to meet their gaze, and for a suspended moment, the rigid hierarchy of Virginia society, master and property, white and black, male and female, evaporated. It was not merely a look of curiosity. It was a moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgement between three people who, for vastly different reasons, felt themselves to be exiles in a world that demanded their obedience. This initial encounter might have been dismissed as a fleeting curiosity were it not for the context provided by the colonel's own journals, which were recovered from the estate's library in 1911. In an entry dated the night of their return, he expresses a profound disquiet, noting that his daughters returned strangers to my house, speaking in riddles, their eyes filled with a hunger I cannot place. He mistook this hunger for a desire for social diversions, or perhaps the restlessness of youth, completely failing to recognize it for what it was, a fundamental rejection of his authority and the societal order he represented. The twins had returned not to assume their roles as future wives of the gentry, but to dismantle the very stage upon which they were expected to perform. The social calendar of the county proceeded as expected, with teas and dinners organized to reintegrate the Whitfield girls into polite society. Yet reports from neighbors indicate a growing strangeness at Oak Haven. The twins were polite but distant, their attention always seemingly focused elsewhere, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. They spent hours in the library, not reading popular novels, but studying texts on contract law and local geography, hiding their true intent behind a veneer of intellectual pursuit. Meanwhile, Samuel was assigned to the arduous labor of the tobacco fields, a deliberate attempt by the overseer to break the haughtiness he perceived in the new arrival. It is crucial to understand the psychological landscape of the twins at this juncture. They were educated women with no legal standing, property of their father until they became property of a husband. Their connection to Samuel, initially perhaps born of a fascination with the other, quickly evolved into a mirror of their own subjugation. In him, they saw a reflection of their own powerlessness, but also a strength of spirit that their father and the preening suitors of the county entirely lacked. This shared isolation became the foundation for a bridge that should never have been crossed, a connection that defied the most deeply held taboos of the antebellum South. The official history of the Whitfield family claims that during this period, the girls were models of virtue, preparing for advantageous marriages that would cement the family's legacy. However, the jagged scratch marks in the family Bible tell a different story, one of a father who realized too late that he was harboring a rebellion under his own roof. The erasure of their names was not an act of grief, but an act of frantic containment, an attempt to cut out a cancer before it could consume the family name. The paradox of their existence, dead in the Bible, alive in the asylum, is the first clue that the events of 1837 were not a domestic tragedy, but a domestic war. The exposition of this mystery thus lies in the silence between the records, in the gap between the public performance of the Whitfield plantation and the private forbidden currents running beneath it. The stage was set not for a romance, but for a collision of worlds. The twins, armed with their secret language and their shared will, and Samuel, armed with his quiet dignity and resilience, were about to engage in a conspiracy that would shatter the peace of Albemarle County. The static air of that Virginia spring was charged with the ozone of an approaching storm, one that would leave no stone of the Whitfield legacy standing upon another. The first crack in the facade of normalcy appeared less than a week after the twins' return, documented in a mundane yet chilling entry within the plantation's punishment log, a ledger kept by the head overseer, Thomas Grindley. Grindley, a man known for his sadistic efficiency, recorded every infraction and subsequent correction with bureaucratic detachment. However, the entry for April 14, 1837 stands out for its abrupt incompleteness and the frantic, heavy handwriting that differs markedly from his usual script. It reads, "Subject Samuel, infraction, insolence of gaze, punishment, 20 lashes, halted at stroke 3 by interference of..." The sentence trails off, followed by a violent ink blot, as if the pen had been slammed down in frustration or shock. Context for this interrupted punishment is provided by a letter written by a visiting cousin, Martha Cunningham, to her mother in Richmond, dated 2 days after the incident. Martha describes a scene of unimaginable embarrassment in the tobacco fields, where the twins, who were taking a morning walk, intervened in the disciplinary action. According to Martha, Caroline did not scream or faint as a delicate lady might. Instead, she physically placed herself between the whip and the enslaved man, while Clara calmly recited the plantation's own codes regarding the damage of valuable property to the stunned overseer. The sisters did not plead for mercy. They issued a command, usurping the authority of the overseer in front of the entire field of workers. This public undermining of the plantation's chain of command was unprecedented. In the rigid hierarchy of 1837, a white woman's interference in the management of field hands was considered a dangerous breach of discipline, one that could invite chaos. Yet, what was most disturbing to the witnesses was not the intervention itself, but the manner of it. Clara and Caroline did not look at the overseer with fear. They looked at Samuel with a terrifying familiarity, a look of possession that inverted the natural order. They were not protecting an asset. They were defending a man they had already claimed as their own. Following this incident, a distinct shift occurred in the plantation's domestic arrangement, confirmed by the colonel's household accounts, which show a sudden change in Samuel's duties. Instead of being punished for being the cause of such a scene, Samuel was transferred from the fields to the main house, purportedly to serve as a heavy lifter for the renovations the twins were overseeing in the library. This decision, likely manipulated by Clara's cool logic, presented to her father, arguing that ruining a strong field hand with excessive whipping was poor economics, brought the object of their obsession directly into the intimacy of their daily lives. Once inside the walls of the mansion, the documentary evidence suggests a rapid dissolution of professional boundaries. The household staff, often the most reliable chroniclers of plantation secrets, began to whisper about the closed-door meetings in the library. A trusted house slave named Sarah, whose oral testimony was transcribed by a Works Progress Administration writer in the 1930s, recalled that Master Samuel, a title never spoken aloud but felt in the atmosphere, was not treated as a servant. He was seated while the sisters read to him. He was given books, and most dangerously, he was listened to. The anomaly deepened with the discovery of a sketchbook belonging to Caroline, found decades later in an antique shop in Charlottesville. The sketches, charcoal on heavy paper, depict Samuel not in the vague, caricatured style common to the era, but with an intimate, impossible precision. There are detailed studies of his hands, the curve of his neck, the scar above his left eye. These were not the drawings of a mistress observing a subject. They were the devotions of a lover memorizing a beloved. The intimacy of the gaze captured on paper speaks of hours of silent observation, of a proximity that violated every social and legal code of Virginia. Furthermore, the headmistress's letter from the Philadelphia finishing school, which had arrived shortly before the twins' return, provides a retrospective context to this behavior. The letter, preserved in the Colonel's correspondence files, warned of the twins' propensity for obsessive fixations and their refusal to socialize with their peers, preferring instead to create elaborate private worlds, which they defended with vicious exclusion. The arrival of Samuel provided a focal point for this lifelong tendency, a center of gravity for their shared hermetic universe. He was not merely a man to them, he was the catalyst that activated their latent rebellion. Tension within the main house began to manifest in the physical environment. Doors that were meant to be open were found locked. The distinct, rhythmic murmuring of the twin language, a cryptophasia they had developed as children and supposedly abandoned, was heard drifting from the library late at night. This private language, incomprehensible to anyone else, became the vehicle for their conspiracy, a linguistic wall built to keep the father out and enclose Samuel within. It was a tool of intimacy that elevated Samuel to their level, granting him entry into a sanctuary where race and status held no sway. The anomaly of the whipping post-intervention was thus not an impulsive act of pity, but the first public declaration of a new allegiance. The twins had signaled to the entire estate that their loyalty lay not with their father, nor with their race, nor with the law, but with the man they had chosen. This fracture in the plantation's absolute authority was the first tremor of the earthquake to come, a sign that the Whitfield girls were no longer merely daughters of the South, but architects of their own dangerous reality. As the humid Virginia summer settled over Albemarle County, the accumulation of strange occurrences at Oak Haven accelerated, recorded in fragmented sources that paint a picture of a household under siege from within. The Black Ledger, a small leather-bound notebook discovered in 1911, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what was once Clara's bedroom, serves as the primary witness to this escalation. Unlike the plantation's official books, which tallied tobacco and corn, this ledger tallied hours with S. It documented a rapidly deepening emotional and intellectual affair, recording conversations about astronomy, philosophy, and the geography of the North, subjects strictly forbidden to be shared with an enslaved person. The ledger entries reveal that Clara, the rational intellectual, was teaching Samuel to read and write at a collegiate level, an illegal act in Virginia punishable by fines and imprisonment. But the instruction was reciprocal. The ledger notes that Samuel taught them the patience of the soil and the architecture of silence. This was not a unidirectional relationship of white benevolence. It was a mutual exchange of power. Clara writes on June 12th, "He possesses a mind like a cathedral, vast and quiet. We are but tourists in his intellect." This reverence for Samuel's mind marked a profound psychological departure from the racist indoctrination of their upbringing. Simultaneously, physical evidence of Caroline's escalating infatuation began to surface. The local seamstress, Mrs. Gable, noted in her billing records an unusual request from the Whitfield twins for 3 matching silk waistcoats, tailored to measurements that did not correspond to the colonel's formidable girth. These garments were far too fine for a servant, yet they disappeared into the household, never to be seen worn by any family member. It was a subtle, dangerous act of domesticating Samuel, dressing him in the vestments of a gentleman within the privacy of their sanctuary, a visual rejection of his status as property. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly claustrophobic. Servants reported that the twins had begun to dismiss the staff early in the evenings, claiming a desire for solitude, only for the library candles to burn until dawn. A letter from the colonel to his brother in Georgia, dated July 1837, complains of a spectral quality overtaking his home. He writes, "I feel as though I am a guest in my own house, watched by a triumvirate. The girls whisper in that devilish tongue of theirs, and the new man, Samuel, moves through the rooms with the assurance of a ghost. I fear the heat has touched their minds." The neighbors, too, began to notice the anomalies. The diary of a neighboring planter's wife, Mrs. Merriweather, details a bizarre encounter on the road to Charlottesville. She describes seeing the Whitfield carriage stop by a stream, with the twins and Samuel sitting together on the bank, not with Samuel standing guard, but seated beside them, sharing an apple. Mrs. Merriweather describes the scene as grotesque in its intimacy, noting that when the carriage passed, none of the 3 hurried to correct their posture. They simply watched her pass with a regal indifference that chilled her to the bone. Within the Black Ledger, the nature of the relationship becomes explicitly defined not as a rivalry between sisters, but as a cooperative pact. An entry in Carolyn's handwriting, jagged and pressed hard into the paper, reads, "We are 2 halves of the same soul, and he is the body that grounds us. Why should we divide what is whole? We shall share the burden of this love as we have shared the burden of our blood." This marked the formalization of their intent. They would not compete for Samuel. They would incorporate him into their dual existence, creating a triad that defied the binary laws of Christian marriage. The risks they were taking escalated with their confidence. Artifacts recovered from the estate's burned ruins in the 20th century included a map of the Underground Railroad routes, carefully hand-copied and annotated in Clara's precise script. This suggests that the relationship was not merely a selfish indulgence of the twins, but was coupled with a genuine conspiratorial effort to plan for a future that seemed impossible. They were not just playing house. They were plotting treason against the state of Virginia, with Samuel as their co-conspirator. The psychological toll of this double life began to manifest in the twins' physical appearance. Visitors remarked on their pallor and the feverish brightness of their eyes. They ceased attending church, feigning illness, likely to avoid the moral dissonance of sitting in a pew while living in what the preacher would call mortal sin. Yet the Black Ledger records no guilt, only a terrified exhilaration. They were drunk on the transgression, feeding off the adrenaline of the forbidden. By late August, the accumulation of these anomalies, the illicit education, the shared clothing, the public intimacy, the secret language, had created a critical mass. The plantation was a powder keg. The colonel, blinded by his own arrogance and the unthinkable nature of the truth, remained paralyzed by confusion, sensing the rot but unable to name it. He did not know that in the heart of his estate, his daughters were not just breaking his rules, they were rewriting the definition of humanity itself, preparing to elevate a piece of property to the status of a husband. As the behavior of the Whitfield twins grew more erratic and insular, the surrounding community of Albemarle County began to formulate their own theories, recorded in the private correspondences and diaries of the local gentry. These sources reveal a society struggling to categorize the uncanny disruption occurring at Oak Haven. The prevailing hypothesis was not one of forbidden romance. Such a thought was too abhorrent to be entertained openly, but rather one of supernatural affliction or madness. The narrative forming among the neighbors was that the twins had been touched or bewitched, a convenient explanation that absolved the society of looking too closely at the racial and sexual transgressions at play. The diary of Elizabeth Merriweather, the neighbor who had witnessed the roadside scene, becomes a crucial document in tracing this community hypothesis. On August 24, 1837, she writes, "It is as if the air around them has thickened. They speak to no one, look at no one. I fear they have delved too deep into those books of theirs and invited a shadow into their spirits. It is said they walk the woods at night, chanting. The colonel is to be pitied, for he harbors 2 witches in the guise of daughters." This description of chanting was almost certainly a misinterpretation of the twins' private language or their reading of poetry to Samuel, distorted by fear into something occult. This hypothesis of bewitchment served a specific social function. It ostracized the twins while preserving the sanctity of the white female image. If they were mad or cursed, they were not responsible for their deviations. However, a darker, more perceptive theory was brewing in the mind of the local physician, Dr. Silas Vane, who attended the family for minor ailments. In his case notes, discovered in a medical archive in Richmond, Vane notes, "The hysteria presents not as chaotic, but as highly organized. They are not out of their minds. They have simply constructed a new mind, one that operates on a logic alien to our own. The new manservant appears to be the fulcrum of this delusion. They look at him not as a slave, but as a deity." Vane's observation touches upon the king in a land of beggars concept found in a fragmented letter from Caroline to Clara. This document, retrieved from the floorboards, offers the internal hypothesis of the twins themselves. They did not view themselves as sinking into depravity, but as rising above a corrupt world. Caroline writes, "They see a brute in the fields. We see a king in a land of beggars. Samuel is the only man among them who knows who he is without a whip in his hand. We are not hiding a sin, sister. We are guarding a revelation." This indicates a radical theological shift. They believed their love was a higher truth, and the society around them was the lie. The rumor mill intensified when the local minister, Reverend Thaddeus Holt, paid a visit to Oak Haven to inquire about the twins' absence from services. His report to the church elders describes a chill in the parlor and the insolent silence of the daughters. He hypothesized that the girls were suffering from intellectual fever, a common diagnosis for women who read too much and recommended isolation. He completely missed the presence of Samuel, who was serving tea during the visit, invisible to the Reverend's eye, but the center of the twins' attention. Among the enslaved community, a different hypothesis emerged, preserved in the oral tradition. They did not see witchcraft, they saw danger. The elders of the quarters recognized the explosive dynamic and feared the inevitable backlash. The story passed down suggests that the slaves believed the twins were stealing Samuel's soul, consuming him with their obsession. They saw the relationship not as a liberation for Samuel, but as a deadly trap, a white folks' game that would end with a black body swinging from a tree. The first hypothesis of the outside world was thus a mixture of superstition and medical ignorance, a desperate attempt to rationalize the irrational. They blamed books, madness, or spirits, refusing to accept the simplest and most terrifying truth, that 2 white women had looked at a black man and found him to be their superior. This collective denial created a buffer zone, a period of grace where the twins operated under the guise of eccentricity rather than treason. However, this protective veil was thinning. The rejection of suitors, the silence in church, and the strange, magnetized atmosphere of the plantation were drawing too much attention. The hypothesis of madness was becoming insufficient to explain the calculated nature of their defiance. The community was beginning to sense that the sickness at Oakhaven was not accidental, but willful. The block concludes with the crystallization of the twins' own self-conception. They had accepted their separation from society. In a margin note of the Black Ledger, Clara calculates the days until the winter solstice, marking it as the Day of the Covenant. The external world thought they were losing their minds. In reality, they were meticulously planning their soul's permanent departure from the world of their father. The hypothesis of the sources was wrong. It wasn't a haunting. It was a revolution. The mounting tension at Oakhaven culminated in the infamous Harvest Dinner of September 1837, an event intended by Colonel Whitfield to reassert his family's standing, but which instead served as the public stage for its social destruction. The primary source for this catastrophe is the journal of Elias Thorne, a wealthy and arrogant suitor from a neighboring county who had set his sights on Caroline. Thorne's account is dripping with disdain and a predator's sharp observation, recording the minute details of a social fracture that would seal the twins' fate. Thorne arrived at Oakhaven expecting a traditional display of Southern hospitality and female submission. Instead, he records a bizarre, almost hallucinatory evening. "The house felt held breath," he writes. "The candles seemed to burn too bright and the shadows too deep." When the twins descended for dinner, they were dressed in identical crimson silk, a bold, almost scandalous color for unmarried virgins, and wore their hair loose, defying the fashion of tight, pinned curls. They greeted the guests with mechanical courtesies, their eyes glossing over the eligible men as if they were furniture. The fracturing of social order occurred during the meal service. Samuel was acting as the head waiter, moving around the table with the silent grace that had so captivated the sisters. Thorne notes with mounting fury that whenever Samuel approached the twins to pour wine or clear a plate, the conversation at the table would falter. "It was not anything said," Thorne records, "but the air between them. Miss Caroline leaned into his presence rather than away. Miss Clara watched his hands on the crystal decanter as if reading a holy text. It was a display of familiarity that made the meat turn to ash in my mouth." The climax of the evening, according to Thorne, came when Samuel accidentally brushed Caroline's shoulder while serving the roast. In any other house, the servant would have flinched or apologized, and the mistress would have ignored it or reprimanded him. Instead, Thorne watched in horror as Caroline closed her eyes and exhaled, a sound of such wanton relief that it stripped the skin from every man at the table. Clara then looked at Samuel and spoke a phrase in their private twin language, soft and guttural. Samuel paused, nodded imperceptibly, and continued. This interaction, lasting only seconds, shattered the illusion of the colonel's control. The guests shifted in their seats, exchanging glances of disbelief. The colonel, seated at the head of the table, turned a violent shade of red, but remained silent, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the moment. To acknowledge it would be to give it reality. To ignore it was to be unmanned in his own dining room. The dinner continued in a suffocating silence, broken only by the clinking of silver and the secret, triumphant glances passing between the sisters. Thorne's journal entry that night transforms from the notes of a suitor to the evidence of an enemy. "They are not eccentric," he writes with venomous clarity. "They are corrupted. There is a rot in this house that smells of musk and treason. They treat that buck like a prince, and us like intruders. I will not be mocked by a woman who lays her eyes on livestock." Thorne's humiliation galvanized his resolve. He would not simply walk away. He decided to watch, to hunt, to prove the impossible sin he had sensed. Following the dinner, the social fracture widened into a chasm. Invitations to Oak Haven were declined by the county's families. The colonel found himself isolated, his reputation tainted by the strange behaviors of his daughters. The Black Ledger records this period not with despair, but with relief. "The parasites have scattered," Clara wrote. "Now there is only us." The sisters viewed the social ostracization as a cleansing, a removal of the obstacles that stood between them and their ultimate goal. However, the isolation also meant danger. With no witnesses to curb him, the colonel's temper grew volatile. The servants reported shouting matches behind closed doors, where the colonel demanded to know what spell had been cast. The twins, emboldened by their public defiance, ceased their pretense of obedience. They began to take their meals in their rooms, served only by Samuel. The main house was effectively divided into two territories: the colonel's domain of fading authority and the twins' sanctuary of rising rebellion. The block ends with the establishment of Thorne's surveillance. He records bribing a stable boy to inform him of the twins' movements. He began to stalk the perimeter of the estate at night, driven by a toxic mix of jealousy and moral outrage. The social fracture had created a vacuum, and into that void stepped Elias Thorne, determined to drag the secrets of Oak Haven into the unforgiving light of Virginia justice. The twins thought they had won their privacy. In reality, they had merely cleared the stage for their executioner. The narrative now pivots to the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case: the Black Ledger itself, analyzed not just for its coded references, but for its explicit confessions of the Pact. This document, which would lay dormant for 70 years, provides the irrefutable proof that the relationship had moved beyond infatuation into a deliberate, structured polygamy. The entry, dated September 14, 1837, is written in a feverish dual handwriting, Clara's sharp script alternating with Caroline's looping scrawl, indicating they were writing it together, perhaps even holding the pen simultaneously. "The law says we own him," Clara writes. "The truth is, we belong to him. We must make it a covenant, not a sin hidden in the dark, but a vow spoken in the light of our own law." This entry marks the transition from a romantic affair to a theological reconstruction. They were not just breaking the law, they were creating a new jurisdiction within the walls of the barn, a sovereign state of three. They outlined the terms of their marriage. They would share Samuel as husband, protector, and equal. They renounced their names, referring to themselves in the book only as Wife I and Wife II, and to Samuel as the husband. The ledger details the dowry they prepared for this union. It was not gold or land, but resistance. They catalogued the risks they were willing to take: loss of station, accepted; loss of family, accepted; death, accepted. This stark accounting reveals the terrifying lucidity of their madness. They were not drifting into this. They were marching into it, with their eyes wide open, weighing the cost of their souls against the value of their love. The impact of this decision on Samuel is also recorded, albeit through the twins' perspective. They describe his initial hesitation, his fear not for himself, but for them. He speaks of the rope, Caroline records. He speaks of the fire. We tell him the fire is already here. Samuel's eventual acceptance is described as a solemn burden. He did not agree to the pact out of lust, but out of a profound sense of fatalistic duty to the bond they shared. He understood that to refuse them was to break them, and to accept them was likely to kill them all. He chose the path of love as a form of martyrdom. The physical preparations for the ceremony were documented with impossible precision. They stole copper wire from the supply shed, believing that copper, a conductor, would bind their energies together. They twisted the wire into 3 rough rings, searing the metal in the fireplace to purify it. These rings, crude and ugly compared to the gold of the gentry, were treated as holy relics. The ledger describes the layout of the altar in the old barn, a bale of hay covered in white linen, lit by stolen beeswax candles. During this period, the colonel's decline accelerated. Plantation records show he ceased managing the accounts, leaving the overseers to run the estate with unchecked cruelty. He spent his days drinking in the study, muttering about serpents in the garden. The twins' withdrawal had broken him, not because he understood the specific nature of their sin, but because he felt the total loss of his dominion. He was a king without subjects, haunting his own halls, while his daughters built a new kingdom in the straw. The Black Ledger also contains the Vows of the Wire, a liturgical text written by Clara. It is a blasphemous, beautiful mixture of biblical verse and romantic poetry. "Where you go, we will go," it reads. "Your blood is our blood. Your chains are our chains. We take this man to be our wedded heart, to hold above all others until the silence takes us." This document removes any ambiguity. This was not a sexual dalliance. It was a marriage in every sense, but the legal one. The psychological impact on the twins was a state of transcendent calm. The nervousness of the summer vanished. They moved with the serenity of nuns. This eerie containment was noted by the house slaves, who began to give the twins a wide berth, sensing the heavy, ritualistic energy clinging to them. Sarah, the housemaid, later recalled, "They looked like they had already died and were just walking around waiting for the funeral." The block concludes with the final entry before the event. "Tomorrow, under the new moon, we become free. Let the world rot. We have built our own heaven." Namu. The Black Ledger closes here, a testament to a doomed utopia. It stands as the irrefutable evidence that the Whitfield scandal was not a chaotic descent into madness, but a deliberate, calculated ascent into a forbidden moral order. They had built a glass castle in the middle of a battlefield, and they were ready to inhabit it, even as the stones began to fly. The night of September 28, 1837, marked the total collapse of the colonel's authority, not through a public riot, but through a private ritual that permanently severed the spiritual laws of the plantation. The ceremony of wire, as it would later be reconstructed from the crime scene evidence, took place in the abandoned drying barn at the edge of the property. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of dried tobacco and ozone, a storm gathering in the distance mirroring the turmoil on the ground. The primary physical evidence of this collapse is the discovery, during a 1969 archaeological survey of the barn's foundations, of 3 oxidized copper rings buried in the dirt floor. These rings, twisted together in an inseparable knot, confirm the permanence of the intent. The ceremony was not meant to be a fleeting act. It was a binding spell. The collapse of authority lay in the fact that the twins had created a ritual that superseded the church and the state. By marrying Samuel, they declared that the laws of Virginia did not apply to them. According to the reconstruction, the twins and Samuel entered the barn separately to avoid detection. Inside, they created a sanctuary. They lit the candles and stood in a triangle, a formation that placed them all on equal footing. There was no master, no slave, only 3 participants in a covenant. The recitation of the vows, whispering into the cavernous dark of the barn, was an act of supreme defiance. With every word, they eroded the foundation of the colonel's power. The narrative focuses on the moment the rings were exchanged. Samuel placed the copper bands on the fingers of Clara and Caroline, and they, in turn, placed a band on his. In that gesture, the property relation was annihilated. A slave cannot wear a wedding ring given by his mistress. By accepting the ring, Samuel ceased to be a slave in the eyes of the twins. By giving it, the twins ceased to be mistresses in the eyes of Samuel. They created a vacuum of authority where only their love existed. Meanwhile, outside the barn, the collapse of the plantation's security was in motion. Elias Thorne, true to his vow, had been watching. He saw the flicker of candlelight through the gaps in the barn boards. He saw the shadows moving. The authority of the privacy of the Whitfield estate was breached by his intrusion. He did not go for the sheriff. He went for the witness. He wanted to see the sin with his own eyes before he destroyed it. The tension inside the barn peaked as the ceremony concluded. The black ledger implies they consummated the union immediately, a desperate, hurried act of physical validation. This was the ultimate subversion, the mixing of bloodlines, the terrifying equality of the flesh. The authority of the racial caste system was dissolved in the straw of the barn floor. They were simply a man and two women, stripped of their history. The documentary tone shifts here to the perspective of the silent observer. The wind howled through the eaves, masking the sound of Thorne's approach. The collapse was not just of the colonel's rule, but of the twins' safety measures. They had believed their heaven was invisible. They had underestimated the hatred of the world outside. The sanctity of their ritual was fragile, held together only by the darkness and their own belief. The narrative highlights the symbolic weight of the copper. Copper conducts energy. It is raw, elemental, unlike the refined gold of society. It symbolized the raw, unrefined truth of their connection. When they put those rings on, they grounded themselves to the earth and to each other, bypassing the artificial structures of society. The block ends with the shattering of the moment. The barn door did not just open, it was thrown back with the violence of a gunshot. The collapse of authority was complete. The secret was out. The private covenant was invaded by the public eye of the antagonist. The ceremony of wire was over. The trial by blood was about to begin. The pivotal revelation of the night's events comes from a source that was never meant to be public. A sworn affidavit filed by Elias Thorne in October 1837, intended to justify his actions to the magistrate, but later buried in the sealed files of the Albemarle County Courthouse. This document, written in the dry, self-righteous language of the law, inadvertently captures the raw horror and beauty of the scene he interrupted. Thorne describes peering through the slats of the barn and seeing a tableau of unimaginable depravity, yet his detailed description betrays a shock that goes beyond moral outrage. He was witnessing a scene of terrifying peace. Thorne writes, "They were knelt upon the straw, the Negro between them, holding their hands as if he were a priest. They looked upon him with a reverence I have never seen in a Christian church. It was not lust I saw, but worship." This admission is critical. It confirms that even the antagonist recognized the spiritual dimension of the pact, even as he moved to destroy it. Thorne's affidavit then details his entry into the barn. He describes kicking open the door, brandishing a lantern and a riding crop, expecting to find them in shame. Instead, he found them in defiance. The violence that followed is described with forensic detachment. Thorne records that he advanced on Caroline, screaming insults, calling her a whore of Babylon. He struck her across the face with the crop, drawing blood. This act of violence against a white woman by a white man was technically a crime. but Thorne frames it as a necessary correction. However, the affidavit then records the unthinkable: Samuel's reaction. "The buck did not cower," Thorne writes with trembling ink. "He did not beg. He rose with the speed of a panther and struck me. He laid hands upon a white gentleman." Samuel, in defense of his wife, broke the ultimate taboo of the South. He punched Elias Thorne, knocking him to the ground. This was a death sentence, instantaneous and irrevocable. But for that singular moment, Samuel was asserting his rights as a husband protector, laws that superseded the black codes. Thorne's affidavit reveals that Clara did not scream. She stood over Thorne as he lay in the straw and said, according to his testimony, "You have no jurisdiction here. Get out." The sheer coldness of her command, given while her sister bled and her lover stood condemned, paralyzed Thorne momentarily. He scrambled backward, retreating not from the physical threat, but from the terrifying realization that the Whitfield twins were completely beyond the reach of shame or fear. The hidden source also reveals a detail often omitted from the oral legends: the presence of the black ledger in the barn. Thorne mentions seeing a small black book near the altar. In the chaos, Clara managed to hide it within her dress. This explains how the evidence survived the night. It was physically secured on her person, a piece of the truth carried through the fire. The affidavit serves as the bridge between the private ritual and the public punishment. Thorne fled the barn, not to go home, but to the main house. He went straight to Colonel Whitfield's bedroom. The document records his pounding on the door, his breathless accusation. "Your daughters are bedded with a beast," he told the colonel, "and the beast has tasted white blood." This source is devastating because it strips away the romanticism of the memory. It shows the brutal, ugly intrusion of reality. It shows the blood on Caroline's cheek, the rage in Thorne's eyes, and the doomed bravery of Samuel's fist. It documents the exact moment the tragedy shifted from a secret to a scandal. The block concludes with the mobilization of the colonel. The affidavit notes that the colonel did not speak. He simply put on his boots, took his pistol from the mantel, and walked out into the night. He did not run. He walked with the heavy, inevitable tread of an executioner. The discovery was made. The judgment was coming. The colonel's reaction to the revelation is documented in the Whitfield estate disposition, a legal memo drafted days later by his attorney, outlining the necessary measures to sanitize the family line. The colonel did not view the event as a betrayal of love, but as a contamination of blood. His decision for decisive action was immediate and absolute: total erasure. He reached the barn to find the twins standing in front of Samuel, forming a human shield. The sight of his daughters protecting a slave with their own bodies broke the last tether of his sanity. He ordered the overseers, who had been roused by the commotion, to seize Samuel. The violence of the capture was brutal. Samuel was beaten into submission, not by the colonel, but by the machinery of the plantation that had sprung into action. The colonel's order was specific. Samuel was not to be hanged on the property. That would create a martyr and a site of pilgrimage for the twins. He was to be sold south immediately, down the river to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate universally understood to be a death sentence by exhaustion. For the twins, the decision was even more chilling. The colonel declared them mentally compromised. He refused to acknowledge their agency. To him, they were infected vessels. He ordered them locked in their rooms until arrangements could be made for their permanent removal from society. He would not have them jailed. He would have them institutionalized. He justified this in the legal memo as benevolent confinement for the preservation of their modesty. However, the colonel underestimated Clara. While locked in her room during the early hours of the morning, she made her own decision for decisive action. A scrap of paper found in the pocket of her dress at the asylum reads simply, "Open the doors, do not speak, just stand." She folded this note and slid it under the door to Sarah, the housekeeper who had been keeping watch. It was a command to the enslaved population of Oak Haven. Clara's justification for this action, deduced from her later writings, was cold and strategic. She knew she could not fight her father with force. She had to fight him with the one thing he feared more than rebellion, the unknown. She weaponized the sheer number of the enslaved people. She didn't ask for a riot. She asked for a witness. She instigated a silent uprising. The narrative describes the tension of that pre-dawn hour. The colonel was in his study, drinking, waiting for the slave traders to arrive at dawn to take Samuel. The twins were imprisoned. Samuel was chained in the smokehouse. The plantation seemed quiet. But in the quarters, the message was moving. The decision to act had been transferred from the white mistresses to the black workforce. This block explores the moral complexity of Clara's order. She was using the slaves as a shield for her lover. It was a desperate, perhaps exploitative act, but one born of absolute necessity. She was gambling that the colonel would not massacre his entire workforce to stop one man. She was betting on greed to save love. The preparations for Samuel's transport were underway. The wagon was being readied. The colonel believed he had won. He had contained the scandal. He would bury the girls in an asylum and work the memory of Samuel out of the land. He did not see the shadows gathering at the edge of the lawn. The block ends with the sunrise. The decisive action was about to unfold. The colonel stepped onto the porch to oversee the transfer. He expected to see a few sullen stable hands. Instead, he saw the result of Clara's note. The decision had been made. The Whitfield legacy would end today. The events of the morning of September 29, 1837, are recorded not in written documents, for the whites refused to write of it and the blacks were forbidden, but in the WPA oral histories collected in the 1930s from the descendants of the Oak Haven enslaved community. These testimonies describe the night of silence, or more accurately, the morning of the wall. The final primary source is the voice of an elderly man named Jubal, who was a child on the plantation at the time. His account provides the interpretation of the impossible scene that paralyzed the colonel. Jubal recounts that, as the sun broke the horizon, the colonel walked out to the smokehouse to retrieve Samuel. But he stopped dead. Surrounding the smokehouse, standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence, were all 200 enslaved people of Oak Haven. They held no weapons. They made no sound. They simply stood, a massive breathing wall of humanity blocking the path to the prisoner. They held torches that had burned down to embers, staring at the colonel with a collective, unblinking gaze. This silent uprising was the manifestation of Clara's order. It was psychological warfare. The colonel shouted orders, threatened to shoot, but the wall did not move. To shoot one was easy. To shoot 200 was financial suicide and a massacre that would bring the federal government down on him. The overseers, terrified by the eerie discipline of the mob, refused to advance. The authority of the whip had been neutralized by the sheer, passive weight of the collective. In the chaos of this standoff, Jubal describes seeing the back door of the smokehouse pry open. It had been rigged by Elijah, the blacksmith. While the colonel was fixated on the front wall of bodies, Samuel slipped out the back. He did not run immediately. He paused, looking up at the window of the main house where he knew the twins were watching. He raised his hand, a final salute, a silent goodbye. Then He vanished into the tree line, heading north toward the Blue Ridge Mountains and the freedom beyond. The interpretation of this event is profound. The twins had orchestrated a moment where the enslaved community used their bodies not for labor, but for obstruction. They had subverted the plantation system to save the man who had married the system's daughters. It was a collaboration of the oppressed against the oppressor. Samuel's escape was not just a flight, it was a victory. The colonel's reaction to the escape was a collapse into catatonia. He realized he had been outmaneuvered by his own property. He fired his pistol into the air, a futile gesture of rage, but the wall of people simply dispersed, melting back into the fields as if nothing had happened. The night of silence left no physical trace, only a psychic wound on the estate that would never heal. Samuel made it to Canada. This is confirmed by a daguerreotype sent to the asylum years later, depicting a man in a freedman's suit, older but unmistakable, standing in front of a snowy pine forest. He never returned, but he lived. The Pact had succeeded in its primary goal, the survival of the husband. The twins watched it all from their window. They saw him run. They saw him disappear. They knew that in that moment, their lives as they knew them were over. They would never see him again. But they also knew they had won. They had defied their father, the law, and death itself. The block ends with the arrival of the carriage that would take them away. The colonel, broken and humiliated, did not speak to them. He simply gestured to the asylum guards. The twins walked out of the house holding hands, heads high. They did not look back at their father. They looked toward the woods where Samuel had gone. They entered the carriage not as prisoners but as victorious generals going into exile. The immediate consequence of the events of 1837 was the erasure of Clara and Caroline Whitfield from the world of the living. The Bible entry was scratched out. Their clothes were burned. Their names were forbidden to be spoken at Oak Haven, but the bureaucratic machinery of the state preserved what the family tried to destroy. The admission records of the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Staunton, Virginia, document their arrival on October 2, 1837. They were listed as incurable, their diagnosis a convenient fiction to explain their rebellion. Dr. Aristarchus Mead, the asylum superintendent, took a special interest in the Whitfield twins. His case notes reveal that they were model patients in every regard but one. They refused to acknowledge they were two separate people. They spoke only in we. They referred to themselves as the wives of Freeman, Samuel's adopted name. Mead viewed this as a delusion. In reality, it was their way of keeping the Pact alive in captivity. They refused to be separated, sleeping in the same narrow bed, sharing their food, maintaining the covenant within the asylum walls. The legacy of their incarceration was a slow, quiet tragedy. They lived in the asylum for 35 years. They never received a visitor. They never received a letter from their father, who died alone at Oak Haven in 1845, the estate falling into ruin as the curse of the silence drove away overseers and buyers. The twins became legends within the asylum, known as the Silent Sisters, who spent their days sitting by the window, watching the North Road. The most haunting document from this period is the Asylum Death Register of 1872. It records that Clara died of pneumonia on the morning of February 12th. The register notes that Caroline, who was in perfect health, sat by her sister's body, held her cold hand, and simply ceased to breathe. She died less than an hour later. The cause of death was listed as sympathetic heart failure. They had entered the world together, they had entered the Pact together, and they left the world together. Samuel's legacy is traced through the Canadian census records. He married a free woman in Ontario, but named his first two daughters Clara and Caroline. This poignant detail confirms that he never forgot the women who sacrificed their freedom for his life. The daguerreotype he sent was found in the asylum's unclaimed property bin, suggesting the twins received it but were forced to hide it. The Whitfield plantation was sold off piece by piece, the story of the twins becoming a ghost story told to scare children. The Night of Silence became a myth among the local black community. A story of the day the power of the master was broken by silence. The physical erasure was almost complete, save for the documents buried in the archives. The consequences were total. The Whitfield line ended. The estate is now a golf course, the history buried under manicured sod. But the moral consequence remains. The twins proved that the human spirit could not be owned. They paid for that proof with their sanity and their freedom, but they paid it willingly. The block concludes with the burial of the twins. They were placed in an unmarked grave in the asylum cemetery, identified only by their patient numbers. They were denied a Christian burial, denied their family name, denied their history. But in the earth, they were finally free of the Colonel's law. They were just bones and wire, resting together. Today, the site of the Western State Lunatic Asylum has been converted into luxury condominiums, the tragic history of its inmates whitewashed by renovation. However, during the conversion in 2004, a final astonishing discovery was made. Workers demolishing a brick wall in what was once the women's ward found a hollow space containing a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters written by Clara and Caroline during their decades of confinement, letters that were never mailed but were hidden as a testament to the future. These letters, written on scraps of paper stolen from the nurses' station, rewrite the entire narrative of madness. They are lucid, eloquent, and defiant. In one final letter, dated shortly before their deaths, Clara addresses the future reader. She writes, "They think they buried us in these walls. They only buried their own shame. We are the only free women Virginia has ever known. We chose our husband. We chose our law. We chose our God. Do not pity us. Pity the men who locked us away because they were too small to understand a love this vast." This discovery forces a re-evaluation of the Whitfield scandal. It was not a tragedy of victims. It was a triumph of martyrs. The twins were not insane. They were political prisoners of a patriarchal, slave-holding society that had no category for their existence. Their madness was simply a refusal to participate in a corrupt reality. The copper rings, now residing in a drawer at the local museum labeled Unknown Artifacts, are the physical proof of their victory. The story of the Whitfield twins challenges us to ask, what is the definition of sanity in an insane world? Was it sane to own human beings and beat them? Or was it sane to love a man and treat him as a king, even if it meant losing everything? The twins answered that question with their lives. They stripped away the illusion of their era to find the only truth that mattered to them. The open question that remains concerns the Black Ledger. Its final pages were torn out. What was written there? Some historians believe it contained the names of the enslaved people who stood in the Wall of Silence, a record of the heroes who saved Samuel. Others believe it contained a curse on the Whitfield line. But perhaps it contained simply the silence that followed them to the grave, the silence of a secret kept perfect and whole. The narrative ends with a shot of the modern landscape, the golf course green and peaceful. But underneath, the roots of the trees still remember the silence. The scratch on the Bible page remains violent and fresh. The story of Clara, Carolyn, and Samuel is not over. It is just waiting for the next layer of the wall to be peeled back. History is written by the victors, but the truth is often hidden by the survivors. The Whitfield twins survived in the only way they could, by becoming the ghosts in the machine of Virginia history, whispering their forbidden vows to anyone brave enough to listen. The walls of the asylum may have fallen, but the echo of the Whitfield twins' defiance still resonates in the archives. If this story of forbidden love, erased history, and the terrifying price of freedom moved you, please subscribe to Before the Story. Click the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the shadows of the past. This investigation was only possible because someone, somewhere, decided to preserve a scratched-out Bible and a hidden ledger. Share this video to help keep their memory alive. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the twins were truly mad, or were they the only sane people in a mad world? Until next time, remember, the most dangerous secrets are not the ones that are lost, but the ones that were hidden on purpose.